I thought cutting my family out of my wedding would be the hardest choice of my life, but nothing could prepare me for the brutal truth I uncovered about their betrayal and lies. It's strange how a few simple lies, told over the years, can warp an entire family until one day you wake up and realize you were never really a part of it at all. I found that out the hard way the day I decided my own parents and brother weren't welcome at my wedding, and somehow even that wasn't the biggest betrayal of all. Growing up, it seemed like we had one of those picture-perfect lives you see in cheap department store photo frames, a decent house with a backyard just big enough for a barbecue, and a couple of family vacations a year that looked better in photos than they ever felt in real time. But all of that started to crumble when I was about 11, the day my little brother, Neil, 7 at the time, got diagnosed with asthma after wheezing himself half to death during some ragtag soccer match on a muddy field behind the school. At first, the doctors said it wasn't even a big deal, just a mild case, nothing that should have rocked the boat, but for my parents, it might as well have been terminal cancer, because overnight, they went from being two people who halfway noticed me to a pair of frantic caregivers whose entire world revolved around Neil's every cough, sneeze, or sneeze that could become a cough. From that day forward, I stopped being a son and started being an afterthought, the shadow walking behind the real story happening in our family, and for the next 17 years, I became very familiar with what it felt like to come second, or more often, not at all. I remember the first time it hit me hard, and it still stings like it just happened yesterday. I was 13, standing alone backstage at my middle school's winter band concert. Heart pounding out of my chest because I was about to perform a drum solo that my teacher said was way beyond anything a kid my age should even attempt. My parents had promised they'd be there, front row center, cheering louder than anyone else. But 20 minutes before the curtain rose, I got a text from my mom. "Sorry, Neil's not feeling great. We're taking him home." I don't remember the solo itself. I barely remember hearing the applause, but I do remember scanning the crowd and realizing that the two empty seats in the front were mine, and they were going to stay that way no matter how hard I played. That became the rhythm of my life after that. Birthdays, graduations, hell, even my Eagle Scout ceremony, they all blurred together under the shadow of Neil's supposed emergencies. That somehow always happened whenever I had something big happening for myself. The worst part? Deep down, I didn't even question it after a while. I just accepted that Neil mattered more, that his coughs were louder than my successes, that his flare-ups were more important than any achievement I managed to scrape together on my own. Fast forward to last year. I'm 28, standing next to the love of my life, a woman named Jamie who somehow saw something in me worth loving even when I could barely see it myself, and we're planning our wedding, talking about seating charts and guest lists. And I can feel it coming like a storm on the horizon, this creeping, sick feeling that if I invited my parents and Neil, I'd be setting myself up for another no-show, another excuse, another milestone in my life hijacked by my brother's sudden, convenient medical crisis. Jamie didn't push me one way or the other. She just sat there holding my hand and asked me the hardest question I've ever had to answer. Do you want to spend your wedding day worried about whether they're going to ruin it? That was the moment something in me snapped, not in a loud, angry way, but in a quiet, almost terrifying kind of way. Like a man finally realizing the people he'd been trying to impress his whole life were never going to clap for him no matter how hard he tried. I didn't make the decision lightly, not even close. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Jamie breathing beside me while my mind tore itself to pieces over whether I was being petty, whether I was going to regret cutting my own flesh and blood out of the biggest day of my life. But when it came down to it, the answer was simple. I wanted to look out at that crowd on our wedding day and feel nothing but love, not a pit of dread, not a sinking suspicion that I'd be second choice once again. So I made the call, no invitation for Mom, Dad, or Neil. And God help me, at the time, I thought that was the end of it. I had no idea it was just the beginning. I never thought silence could feel so loud, but that's exactly what it felt like the night we sent out the wedding invitations, 80 envelopes, each hand addressed with shaky, hopeful fingers, and not one of them going to the people who were supposed to be my family. I remember staring at the 3 invites that never got sealed, never got stamps, just sat on the edge of the table like ghosts that refused to leave. 1 for Mom, 1 for Dad, and 1 for Neil. Jamie came over and quietly picked them up. She didn't say a word, just tucked them back in the box like they were dangerous, like leaving them out might change my mind. And for a minute, I almost did. For a minute, I imagined sending them anyway, picturing some fantasy where my parents showed up, apologized, acted proud, maybe even said they were sorry for all the times they weren't there. But then I remembered who they were, and I knew if I gave them the chance, they'd ruin this too. So we moved forward. And let me tell you something. There's a strange kind of peace that comes from knowing the worst isn't going to happen. I didn't have to wonder if Neil would fake an asthma attack during the vows. I didn't have to brace myself for Mom clutching her pearls and rushing off in a panic because Neil wasn't feeling well again. I didn't have to guess whether I'd end up alone at the head table while my parents sat on the curb outside taking care of their golden boy. Instead, I had Jamie's parents, who cried when I gave my vows, and her sisters, who stood by me like they'd known me all their lives. Her dad gave a toast that started with, "When my daughter first brought him home," and ended with, "He's the son we never had, but always wanted." I don't cry easily, but I came close. The whole day felt like a dream that someone else should have been living. People actually came to see me. They cheered for us. They hugged me like I mattered. And for the first time since I was a kid, I believed it. But the peace didn't last. Because someone, I still don't know who, posted a photo from the reception. Just one snapshot. Me dancing with Jamie under the soft light of the chandelier. A rare smile on my face. Arms wrapped around the only person who ever made me feel like I came first. That picture made its way onto Facebook, and by the time we landed in Hawaii for our honeymoon, my phone was already blowing up with 100 missed calls, voicemails, and texts that ranged from, "How could you?" to "You're sick," to, "We saw the photos. You really did it, didn't you?" My mother's voicemail was the first one I listened to. Her voice was icy, clipped like someone who'd just been slapped in public. She said, "You've always resented Neil. That's all this is. You're punishing us for taking care of our sick son. You need help. My father's was worse. You deliberately excluded us to humiliate us. Everyone's talking about it. What kind of son does this?" It felt surreal, like they'd watched a different movie and decided I was the villain. Not once did they ask how the day went. Not once did they say they were happy for me. Just more guilt, more rage, more reminders that Neil's feelings came first, always. And then came the kicker, a message from Neil himself. 3 words. "Nice wedding, bro." I stared at that message for what felt like hours, because I couldn't figure out if it was sarcasm or just empty. Either way, I didn't respond. I locked my phone, turned it face down, and finally let the tears come. Jamie wrapped her arms around me, and I just sat there on the edge of a hotel bed in paradise, crying over people who never showed up again. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't even imagine, was that the biggest betrayal wasn't behind me. It was still coming. And this time, it wasn't going to come with excuses about migraines or flare-ups. It was going to come with the truth. And that truth would break everything I thought I knew about my family. A couple weeks after we got back from our honeymoon, Jamie and I hosted a little dinner at our place. Nothing fancy, just a way to thank the folks who had been there for us. Her parents came, her sisters brought wine and too much dessert, and my grandparents made the drive in from Joliet, slower than they used to, but still smiling like nothing had changed in the world. It was during dessert that my grandfather leaned over and said, real quiet, "I saw Neil at the baseball game that day. The day you got married." I stopped mid-bite, fork dangling in the air. "What?" "Yeah," he said, like he didn't realize what he was saying. "Out with a couple friends. Laughing, drinking a beer. Looked perfectly fine to me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Neil always bounced back fast after one of his episodes, and I'd long stopped trying to keep up with what was real and what was just convenient timing. But later that night, lying in bed, the words kept echoing in my head. Because according to my parents, Neil was devastated. Apparently, he was so crushed by the wedding snub that he'd ended up in the emergency room with breathing issues. According to them, he was struggling to cope. Funny, didn't look that way from section 104 with a hot dog and a beer. I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole, I really didn't. But once the suspicion planted itself, it grew like mold. I started thinking back to all those emergencies from the past. The missed piano recital. The birthday party where my cake never showed. The homecoming dance I waited for in a suit and tie while Neil was rushed to the ER for what turned out to be gas. They always had an excuse. Always a reason why he needed them. Always a justification for missing out on my life. But what if the reasons were lies? What if Neil had been faking it all along? I didn't want to believe that. I wanted to believe he'd been a sick kid who needed help. that our parents were just overwhelmed and did their best. But if he had been fine at a ball game the same day they claimed he was in the ER, then what else had they lied about? The next day, Jamie's mom, God bless her, made a call. She's a pediatric nurse who's seen everything from real emergencies to overbearing parents with WebMD addictions, and she offered to talk to my mom, just to open the door, to say, hey, maybe now that everyone's grown, it's time to start fresh. She thought maybe, just maybe, this could be the thing that started healing. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. My mother hung up on her after 2. No apology, no reflection, just, how dare you question my son's health? That was all I needed to hear, because if there was nothing to hide, there wouldn't have been any offense to take. Still, I wasn't ready for what came next. A few days later, my cousin Kay called. We were never that close growing up, but she'd been at the wedding and always seemed like one of the few in the family who had a working moral compass. She said, I didn't want to tell you this, but I think you deserve to know. Then she dropped the bomb. Neil told her, years ago when they were both drunk at a family party, that he used to fake being sick on purpose, especially when I had something big going on. He said it started as a way to get attention, but then it became something else. It became a way to win. He called it a game. A game. All those times I stood on a stage with no one in the crowd, all those nights I cried in my room while Mom and Dad rushed to the ER for the 50th time. I wasn't just unlucky. I was the target. Neil wasn't a sick kid. He was a jealous one, and he knew exactly what he was doing. There's something that happens when a lie unravels. Not all at once, like in the movies, but slowly, like pulling at the thread of a sweater you didn't realize was holding the whole thing together. Once Kay told me about Neil's confession, the rest of the memories started to fall apart in my mind. Not like distant moments from the past, but like crime scenes I had to walk through again, step by painful step. I remembered the night I was 17, standing in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the sleeves of the dress I'd worked months to afford. It was midnight blue, satin with silver accents, fitted perfectly after 3 separate trips to the tailor. I bought it because I was nominated for homecoming court, something that felt at the time like I'd finally been seen, not just as Neil's older brother but as someone who mattered on his own. That night, as I was putting on cologne and fixing my tie, Neil started groaning from the couch, claimed he had stomach pain so bad he couldn't stand. I remember Mom rushing to him like he'd been shot. I remember Dad telling me to hang tight, because they just needed to rule out appendicitis. I waited, for hours. My date texted me twice, then stopped. The headlights from my parents' car didn't come back until after 11. By then, the music at the dance had faded out, the court had been crowned, and my dress shoes were still spotless. And the diagnosis? Gas. They left me in a tuxedo for gas. I remember folding that dress shirt over the hanger like it was a piece of broken glass. It never came out of the closet again. I didn't even sell the suit. Something about it felt sacred and cursed at the same time. At the time, I thought I was just unlucky. But now, knowing what I know, he'd done it on purpose. He didn't even try to hide it from Kay. He admitted it was jealousy. Admitted it became almost a rush to see how far he could take it. And our parents? They never questioned a single episode. Never paused to ask why every flare-up happened to coincide with my milestones. Then came the next punch. Kay didn't just tell me what Neil had said. She showed me something. Screenshots. Texts. From my mom. Sent the week before my wedding. Messages where she and Neil were planning to keep things calm, in case he had a panic attack that day. One message even said, we may need to leave if Neil starts feeling overwhelmed. Maybe during the ceremony, just in case. Just in case. My mother, my own mother, had been planning to walk out of my wedding before knowing she wasn't invited. Like they were already setting the stage to make that day about him. Reading those words felt like a punch to the throat. I couldn't breathe. I'd spent years doubting my own memories, wondering if I was being unfair, if I was the one being dramatic. But this was proof. Cold, black and white proof that they were willing to sabotage my life just to keep Neil centered in theirs. I sent the screenshots to a few relatives, the ones who had called me selfish for not inviting my parents. One by one, the messages started coming back. Apologies. Regret. Even my uncle texted, I always wondered why your parents acted like the world revolved around him. Now I get it. But the worst part wasn't the lies. It was realizing just how comfortable they were telling them. Neil didn't just manipulate my parents. He trained them. And they followed blindly. Jamie sat beside me on the couch, her fingers laced with mine, tears in her eyes but her voice calm. "You were never crazy," she said. "They just made you feel that way." And in that moment, something inside me hardened, not out of hatred, not even anger. It was the quiet realization that whatever thread connected me to my family by blood had already snapped years ago. I just hadn't heard it break until now. The days after Kay showed me those texts were strange, like walking through a version of my life I thought I knew, but now every corner looked suspicious, every memory filtered through the sick, new lens of betrayal. It wasn't just that Neil had faked his illnesses, it was that my parents had gone along with it for so long they stopped caring whether it was real. As long as the attention flowed toward him, nothing else mattered. Not my birthdays. Not my graduation. Not even my wedding. It wasn't long before the news spread through the family. Not from me, but from Kay, who had seen enough. She sent the screenshots to my aunt, my mom's older sister, and by the end of the week, they'd made their way to almost every relative who'd ever tried to guilt-trip me about excluding family. I didn't ask her to do it, but I'm glad she did. Because what happened next was the first time in my life people started seeing the truth. Some of those relatives called to apologize. Others said nothing but went dead quiet, which honestly told me enough. But then came the unexpected one. My aunt, the same woman who once told me I needed to let the past go after my parents skipped my college graduation, called me one evening with a voice I barely recognized. She said, "I read everything. I'm sorry. Your mom always did make everything about Neil. I just never wanted to believe it." That hit me harder than I expected. For years, I thought I was alone in this, that maybe I was exaggerating, maybe I was the ungrateful one. But now I realized the truth had always been there. People just chose to look away. A few days later, Jamie's family hosted a small post-wedding dinner at their place for the out-of-town relatives who couldn't make the actual ceremony. It wasn't meant to be anything big, just food, drinks, stories, but when Jamie's dad stood up during dinner and gave a toast, I nearly lost it. He didn't talk about family in the generic way people do, he named things. My scholarship. My work ethic. The way I still send money to my grandparents every month even though no one asked me to. He said, "You're the kind of man who makes people proud, not because you shout about what you've done, but because you do it even when no one's looking." I had to leave the room. I didn't cry, but I was close. Because I had never in my life heard someone talk about me like that. Not my own father. Not my mother. Definitely not Neil. And for the first time, I started to wonder if maybe the family I thought I'd lost wasn't worth missing in the first place. Of course, that's when my parents decided to step back into the picture through the only way they knew how. Guilt? They called. Texted. Left voicemails. Angry, then pleading, then furious again. My mother told me Neil had suffered a panic attack after being ostracized and had to go to the ER again. My father said I was destroying the family name by airing dirty laundry. They made it sound like I was the one starting the fire, not the one who had spent 2 decades putting them out. I ignored them. Then came the one that pushed me too far. An email from my father titled, "A Real Son Would Apologize." He accused me of selfishness. Of being dramatic. Of betraying the people who sacrificed everything for me. He wrote, "We chose to care for a sick child. You never understood that." But I did understand. They didn't choose to care for Neil. They chose to forget about me. They chose to believe whatever story made Neil the center of attention. And when that stopped working, they tried to spin me into the villain. The scapegoat. The bitter, angry son who couldn't let go of the past. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I blocked them all. Phone. Email. Social. Everything. I muted the noise. For the first time in my life, I gave myself silence. Not out of spite, but out of survival. And I started to breathe again. It had been maybe 3 weeks since I went no contact with my parents and Neil, and in that short time, I'd started to feel something I hadn't felt since I was a kid riding my bike alone around the neighborhood. Peace. Not joy exactly, not yet, but a calmness, like I didn't have to brace for disappointment anymore. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, I got an email from Neil. The subject line just said, "I owe you an apology." I sat there staring at it, heart pounding in that old, familiar way I used to feel every time he got sick and ruined something for me. I almost didn't open it. I almost deleted it just to keep the calm. But I couldn't help myself. Inside, there was no long justification, no dramatic sob story, no twisting of facts. Just a carefully written, almost timid apology. Neil wrote that he'd started therapy, originally for anxiety, but the process had opened up something deeper. He said, "I lied to get attention. I lied a lot. especially when I thought you were getting more of it than me. He talked about how, as a kid, he figured out that every time he said he didn't feel good, Mom and Dad dropped everything. He called it a reward system, and yeah, that's exactly what it was. They praised him for needing them. They comforted him for being weak. And slowly he leaned into it. He admitted he ruined my homecoming on purpose. He said he faked the panic attack during my graduation week. He said he even considered crashing my wedding until he saw that I hadn't invited them, and he realized for the first time that maybe he didn't deserve to be there. Then came the line I'll never forget. I think I got addicted to being the victim because it was the only role I knew how to play. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg to be back in my life. He just said he was trying to untangle the lies he'd wrapped around himself for so long, and he hoped I was building a good life now, the kind of life I was always meant to have. And for the first time, I cried for Neil. Not for the version I'd known, the manipulative, jealous kid who stole every one of my milestones, but for the broken young man who never learned another way to be loved. But what wrecked me even more? He wasn't just owning his part. He called out our parents. He said they made me this way. But they hurt you worse. They saw what I was doing, and they encouraged it. Because it was easier to deal with a sick kid than a thriving one they couldn't control. That was the moment the floor shifted under my feet. Because up until then, I thought I'd just been the unlucky brother. I thought I'd been pushed aside in the name of compassion. But no, this wasn't just favoritism. This wasn't about Neil needing more than I did. It was about control. It was about two parents who needed to feel needed and a son who gave them that, while the other son, the one who stood on his own, was seen as a threat to the whole illusion. I didn't respond to Neil right away. I wasn't ready. I forwarded the email to Jamie and sat in the living room for an hour, just staring out the window while the sun dropped below the rooftops. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she whispered, "You deserved so much better than what they gave you." I nodded, finally saying the words I never let myself believe until then. I know. Later that week, Jamie and I went for coffee with Kay again. She hugged me for a long time, like she was trying to hold together something that had been falling apart inside me for too long. She told me that when she confronted Neil about the texts from Mom, he didn't deny it. He just cried. She said he looked like someone who was finally seeing his own reflection after years of walking through a fog. But none of that changes what happened. None of it gives me back my childhood. It doesn't give me the memories I should have had of my parents cheering from the front row, of birthday cakes that made it to the table, of a brother who had my back instead of stabbing it quietly behind the scenes. Still, that email mattered. Because it meant I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was just the one they left behind. Neil's email sat in my inbox for a full week before I replied. Every day, I'd open it, read it again, and feel something different: grief, anger, relief, betrayal, even guilt. It was like peeling away layers of old wallpaper and realizing the cracks underneath went all the way down to the foundation. And maybe it wasn't just about what Neil had done. It was about what I'd allowed myself to believe, because it hurt less than facing the truth. When I finally replied, I didn't go into everything. I didn't list the nights I spent alone at award ceremonies, the meals I ate cold while Neil got ice cream in a hospital bed for faking migraines. I didn't bring up the homecoming dance or the science fair or the dozen other moments he turned into scenes from a one-man tragedy. Instead, I told him this: "Thank you for saying the truth. I'm still working on what to do with it." He responded once more, short, respectful. Said he understood. Said he didn't expect anything from me, but he hoped one day, if I felt ready, we could meet. Even just for coffee. I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no. Jamie and I were packing for a move by then. She'd accepted a research job in Boston, and I'd been offered a position at a biotech firm out there. It felt like the right time for a clean start. A new city, new air, somewhere my last name didn't carry a history I didn't ask for. The day before we left, I got a voicemail from my mom. I hadn't heard her voice in over a month. And hearing it again, it didn't hit me the way it used to. There wasn't a sting, just a hollow ache, like hearing a song you used to love before you learned the story behind it. She said, "I hope you're happy with what you've done to this family. Neil can barely sleep. Your father's blood pressure's through the roof. I'm worried sick, but of course you wouldn't care. You're off starting a new life while we sit here picking up the pieces. If you have any decency left, you'll call." She never once acknowledged what Neil did. She never mentioned the screenshots, the lies, the planning. To her, I was still the villain. That was all I needed to hear. I deleted the voicemail and blocked the number again. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt zero guilt doing it. The day we hit the road for Boston, Jamie reached over and squeezed my hand while we were on I-90 somewhere in Indiana. She said, "It doesn't have to be perfect. Just better than where we came from." I nodded. That's enough for me. But closure has a funny way of sneaking up on you, not when you expect it, not even when you ask for it. It shows up in quiet moments when the noise finally fades. For me, it came in the form of a memory. I was unpacking a box at our new apartment when I found something I hadn't seen in years, an old photograph. I don't even remember who took it. I was 15, standing on the front lawn in a beat-up suit, holding a certificate from a math competition I'd won. No one else in the picture. Just me, holding the paper, smiling like a kid who still believed his parents might come outside any second and say, "We're proud of you." They never did. They were inside with Neil that day. He had a stomachache. Again. I looked at that kid in the photo and I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt protective. Like I wanted to tell him, it's not your fault they didn't show up. They were never going to. And maybe that's what healing is. Not forgetting. Not forgiving right away. Just finally seeing the truth and deciding it no longer controls you. The first month in Boston felt like waking up from a long, heavy dream. No familiar streets reminding me of old arguments, no awkward run-ins with family at the grocery store, no birthdays ruined by a phone call that should have been a celebration but somehow twisted into guilt. It was just me and Jamie and a fresh start that didn't come with the weight of everything I had to leave behind. But healing, I learned, isn't clean. It doesn't come with a big fireworks moment where suddenly everything makes sense. Some days it felt good. Other days I woke up with a tightness in my chest, wondering if maybe I had overreacted, wondering if I should have tried harder, been stronger, been whatever they needed me to be. Then I'd remember the voicemails, the texts, the pictures of Neil grinning at a baseball game while I stood alone in an empty auditorium. And I knew I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. About 6 weeks after we settled in, Neil reached out again. A simple message, "I'm in Boston next weekend. No pressure, but if you want to grab a coffee, I'd really like to see you." I stared at it for a long time. Jamie saw me reading it and didn't say a word. She didn't push. She didn't even ask. She just waited, trusting me to decide if I was ready to look the past in the eye. After a lot of pacing around the apartment, I texted back, "Okay. 1 hour. Public place." We met at a small cafe near downtown, one of those places with mismatched chairs and chalkboard menus, the kind of spot where nobody cares who you are. Perfect. When Neil walked in, it felt like looking at a stranger wearing my brother's face. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, he was still a couple inches shorter than me, but smaller in the way a person looks when they're carrying guilt too big for their shoulders. He didn't hug me. Didn't even try. He just sat down across from me, hands shaking slightly as he stirred a cup of black coffee he barely drank. For a long moment, we just sat there, the air thick with everything that didn't need to be said. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer than before. "I'm sorry for all of it. I know it's not enough, but I needed you to hear it." I nodded. Not because it made things right, but because I needed to hear it too. We talked for a while. Not about the past, not really. We talked about his therapy, about how he's trying to figure out who he is when he's not sick, when he's not the center of every emergency. He admitted he was terrified, that he didn't know how to live without being the one everyone else revolved around. I listened. Because despite everything, some part of me still remembered the little brother who used to beg me to build Lego castles with him before all the sickness and the lies started. When our hour was up, I stood up and he did too. He didn't ask to stay longer. He didn't push for anything more. And just before he walked away, he turned and said, "You were always better than me. You just never got the chance to show it." It didn't feel like victory. It didn't even feel like justice. It just felt sad. I watched him leave, then turned and walked back toward the life I was building brick by brick without them. That night, I sat with Jamie on our small balcony, a cheap bottle of wine between us, the city glowing below. I told her, "I don't know if I'll ever have a real relationship with Neil. Or my parents. Or anyone from that world." She nodded and said, "You don't have to decide right now. You don't have to decide ever if you don't want to. And maybe that's the real ending to all of this. Not a clean break. Not a full reconciliation. Not some movie moment hug where all the years melt away. Just freedom. The freedom to build a life that isn't about managing someone else's emergencies. The freedom to celebrate my own milestones without waiting for someone to take them away. The freedom to be more than the shadow of someone else's story. I don't know where the road leads from here, but for the first time, it's mine. And that's enough."